Greetings, Dr. Mark Winton here from the Department of Criminal Justice at the University of Central Florida. And in this video, what I would like to do is revisit the case of Leopold and Loeb. So this video is Leopold and Loeb Part 2. And I'm going to base much of this discussion on a book that you may obtain online through the UCF library with your UCF credentials. And the book is by Shapiro, Golden, and Ferguson, titled Retrying Leopold and Loeb, a Neuropsychological Perspective, published in 2018 by Springer. Now, one of the reasons I brought this case back in is discovering this book and keeping up with some of the literature on the case. So we're talking about a case that occurred almost 100 years ago. So we're looking in the 1920s at this case. And what we're going to do is to look at what would happen using current methodologies regarding mental illness and criminal activity. One of the things I wanted to mention is that the first part of this Leopold and Loeb Part 1 comes out of my famous Crimes and Trials course, which I made several years ago for that course. And then recently I discovered this book that did the reanalysis, and I thought that's really kind of fascinating because it not only helps us with the history, but it also tells us more about diagnostic procedures and how the public and how the criminal justice system might view this case today. So what if the trial was conducted today? So we're going to take a contemporary look using current mental health knowledge. I also wanted to mention that the first Leopold and Loeb video I made for my famous Crimes and Trials is one of my more popular videos, which is interesting that a lot of people that are outside of the course where I use it watch the video as well. And I've even a playwright created and conducted a play based on Leopold and Loeb recently, and sent me the play, which was just excellent, and just a fascinating take on that as well. So it's still very, very popular. So let's take a look. According to Shapiro et al., that they point out that this was the perfect storm, and that it would have been unlikely that either of these perpetrators would have killed on their own. So this also tells us a little bit about group behavior. And that's very important for us as well. So let's first take a look at Nathan Leopold and see what Shapiro and colleagues have to say about Nathan as it relates to mental disorders today. Well, Nathan had a delusion that he was this Nietzschean Superman, that he was very, very powerful in that sense. He also had neurological abnormalities, and it is believed that his delusions, his grandiose delusions, were related to frontal lobe lesions that he had in his brain. But of course, Shapiro and colleagues point out there are many factors related to delusional thinking: biological, psychological, and sociological, and a combination of those. Also, part of this may be related to post-traumatic stress related to sexual abuse allegations that Leopold was alleged to have been a victim of child sexual abuse. And also, based on x-rays at the time, the doctors found osteosclerosis and other abnormalities in the suture lines of the brain. So I already mentioned neurological abnormalities, and they saw those using x-rays that they had at the time. They didn't have the MRI machines and fMRI and so on that we use today. So it's believed that those delusions that he had were related to brain dysfunctions, and he kind of had the idea that he could do whatever he wanted to do, that the rules didn't really apply to him, and he wanted this hedonistic lifestyle of all pleasurable activities and adventures. He also had some other medical findings, and so, for example, kidney disease and several others. And Shapiro and colleagues point out that today he would have received a PET scan with a merging of the medical and psychological factors. In contrast, Shapiro and colleagues point out that Richard Loeb was immature with childlike judgment and emotions, and that he did not show any signs of empathy. He also seemed to lack emotions and had no remorse for the murder. And according to Shapiro and colleagues, his characteristics are considered with psychopathy. In other words, they believe that he had the characteristics of a psychopath. He had a head injury at age 15, although his deviant behaviors occurred much earlier. So they wouldn't be attributed specifically to an event that had not yet occurred, obviously. It's likely that he had brain abnormalities. He had a very low resting heart rate that has been shown to be linked to aggressiveness. And the authors apply the Hare psychopathy checklist revised to Loeb. And so you may have remembered that we addressed the psychopathy checklist and Dr. Hare's work that really is considered, one of the gold standards for for determining if someone would meet the characteristics of being a psychopath or not. And so they score Loeb based on the court documents and what's known about him, 28, where the cutoff is 30, but others have used 26 as the cutoff when someone would be determined to be psychopath versus non-psychopath. So he's basically on the border, we might say. And he exhibited most of the psychopathy symptoms. And so, going over those, if we look at Loeb, and this is a good review also, the psychopathy symptoms, the interpersonal ones, superficial charm, his grandiose sense of worth, his pathological lying and his manipulativeness, his affective characteristics or symptoms, for example, his lack of guilt or remorse, his shallow affect or feelings, his lack of empathy, and his failure to accept responsibility. Also with his lifestyle, his need for stimulation, his parasitic lifestyle, his lack of long-term goals, his impulsivity and his irresponsibility, and then his antisocial symptoms, poor behavioral controls, early behavioral problems, juvenile delinquency, and criminal versatility. So we see, some of those, and if you look at those, you can see in the story, in the court cases, and the writings about Loeb, that he had some of those characteristics, and of course, in different degrees. But what about Leopold's success in prison and after? So now jumping over back to Leopold, what happened? Did he burn out of his pathology, or did the prison environment keep his pathology in check? And then we also ask the question, who was the leader of the two? And how do we bring in a social interaction perspective? Remember, excitement seemed to be one of the main factors related to the killing of the child. And we also might ask, if they were not quickly arrested, do you think they would have continued to kill? So there's really a lot more to think about. Especially Remember that Loeb was killed in prison early on, but Leopold was released from prison and had helped a lot of people in prison with their education and had written a lot, and was quite intelligent in many ways. So how do we make sense of all this, and how does the psychopathy, symptoms and characteristics help us understand how that's related? And here, really, what we end up doing, I think, is realizing that this whole thing is multifactorial. That there's multiple, factors that help us understand these two individuals, as well as the interactive aspects of them working together as a team to kill rather than as individuals. So a lot to think about, but I think it's a very useful case to revisit. And certainly maybe we'll see in the future a lot more models like this of revisiting cases that have occurred, many years ago, and then thinking about, well, what's this going to look like, in the future, 5, 10, 15, 25 years from now or more. Thank you.